New videos every day.
Okay, so I'm John Breeding. I'm here in my Jazz Festival shirt brought to me from New Orleans by my wife. I was not there. But as Mike said, I'm a professor, so I can wear whatever I want, right? That's just a joke. But I was asked to speak about the insanity defense. I have to tell you that I'm not really an expert enough to know really the ins and outs of how to really speak about that in a good way. But I can say some things in general, and I can defer to my mentor and the real expert in the area, who's Thomas Zotz, who I've mentioned a lot. But his book we've got one book called Insanity, but all of his books address this issue in the problematic interface of psychiatry and the law, which is a mess. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. But first, let's review some basics. Tom Zotz's basic analogy from The Manufacture of Madness: the Inquisition is to heresy as psychiatry is to mental illness. That's one worth remembering. The Inquisition is to heresy as psychiatry is to mental illness. The inquisitors save souls by going after heretics, disbelievers, unbelievers, infidels. Psychiatrists save psyches by going after mentally ill, defective psyches, right? Science replaces theology as a major mechanism of social control. If you try to think about this whole thing of insanity, sanity, mental illness, mental health system, psychiatry, whatever, and you miss the point of social control, you've missed the boat. You got to understand that dynamic. It's about power and control. It's the use of language to define a situation in the way that you have power over it. Political science professor friend of mine defined politics as dispute over the power to define other people's reality. That's really a good definition, you know. So if I can define your reality as one in which there's people with biologically or genetically based mental illnesses that need to be handled and controlled, then I've got a whole gig going there. I can define you as schizophrenic. That gives me the right to force you into psychiatric prison and force toxic psychiatric drugs into your system because I've defined you according to this criteria. And the same thing's true for ADHD or bipolar or whatever. It's a language thing. The language and the pseudoscientific theory that goes with it that says mental illness is a biological or genetic defect. We've gone over this many times. But this is incredibly important when you're going to understand the interface of psychiatry and the law. How you define language. A friend of mine gave me this example from Thomas Zotz. Zotz was at a meeting of human rights activists in the area of psychiatric repression, and somehow the conversation was about patient rights, and you could see that Zotz was getting kind of worked up, and finally, the story is, this is anecdotal, I wasn't there, but the story is that Zotz finally says, he pounds the table and he gets up and says, I don't know what he said exactly, but he was like, don't you get it, it's not about patient rights, it's about human rights, You define somebody as a patient, and then you're looking at they should have some rights even though they're a patient. But defining them as a patient takes him out of the basic discussion of just by the fact of being a human being in a society that's presumably democratic and has civil rights, you have rights. And they don't change because somebody calls you a patient or not. Do you get it? Patient rights is kind of a pathetic dynamic. It means you have a right to a kangaroo court at the state hospital before you're committed, and there's an assigned lawyer to defend you, supposedly, But really everybody's just trying to figure out what's best for you. And 99% of the time you get committed based on some doctor's opinion and the judge rubber stamps it. That's psychiatry and the law. Your rights are trod on once you've defined as a mental patient. It's about social control. Control of what? Troubling people? troubling behavior, troubling thoughts, troubling feeling, troubling speech, a family member who's troubling, define them as mentally ill. You can get the state to handle them in the mental health system, right? Kind of how it works. A citizen in the community who's troubling, but not necessarily breaking the law. You can go to the one pillar, of course, of psychiatry, which is called involuntary commitment, called forced incarceration of a citizen who's not broken the law. It happens to about 1.5 million people in this country every year. That's political. That's preventive detention of people who some people in the society consider troubling, and yet they're not breaking the law. The insanity defense comes in a little different dynamic when the law presumably is broken, and somebody wants to say, but it's because that person's crazy, so they're not responsible. We're going to talk about that. It's political. It's all political. And you got to get this. It's about the power to define reality and to assert control based on that definition. I don't know if you know this story. Sigmund Freud was the original psychoanalyst analyzing these patients, finding these women with so-called conversion hysteria, paralysis without a real cause of it. Now we call it psychogenic, hysterical paralysis, whatever. And then as they were analyzing, they got back to the roots of their child abuse, as sexual abuse is a story, then they would regain function because they would become conscious what the distress really was. That was the theory. Later on, Freud decided it wasn't real sexual abuse, it was imagined sexual abuse. He had the whole theory of infantile sexuality and the whole Oedipus-Electra complex and the idea that a child was attracted to the same-sex parent and would imagine and fantasize, and that would include sexual fantasies. And that was the distress. But some people who came after Freud, including Jeffrey Mason, who wrote the books based on his being the curator of the Freudian archives, he wrote Assault on Therapy, and he basically concluded that Freud had sold out of conscious or unconscious kind of political and social pressures, because who was he analyzing? The daughters of upper crust Victorian Austria, where sex was not talked about, and who was paying for this 5 days a week intensive psychoanalysis, which would be the equivalent of whatever, $1,000 a week nowadays. Who could pay for that? The wealthy fathers. So what's going to happen? He's starting this new enterprise called psychoanalysis, trying to get it established as an esteemed medical profession. And then he's accusing the preeminent men of the town of sexually abusing their daughters. Some say that there's an incentive there for him to decide that this is really imagined abuse. Well, that's an interesting story. But let's move it to the insanity plea per se. Zotz writes about this really well, but in his book on suicide called Fatal Freedom, he lays it out that, what's really one thing that's going on with the whole idea of suicide and the whole prohibition against it as a taboo historically and right up into modern Western civilization was that it was not okay to commit suicide. It was a sin. Right? And then it was an offense against the law. Right? And so, if you committed suicide, you're either a sinner or a lawbreaker. And the law at the time, in England and those places, was that the descendants of the person who committed suicide were liable. And so the children of the suicided, would in effect be punished by having the property taken away. Right? And so these judges would be sitting in these courts, and these children, they started feeling bad about taking all this property away from these children, their inheritance. But there was a suicide, and that was the law. So how to get around the law and still have some mercy? And then what they came up with was insanity, basically, that he committed suicide because he was mentally imbalanced. So wasn't liable and wasn't responsible, wasn't competent. So therefore, the children can have the inheritance after all. It was a way of extending mercy and still hold to the letter of the law. You follow that? This is so important. Later on, around 1800, in that part of the world, United Kingdom, this guy killed the secretary of the British Prime Minister, Robert Peel, shot him in the back. They had a big trial and everything, and they won an insanity plea for this guy, and the McNaughton rules were developed out of that, and they still apply. And it's basically the standard for insanity that says you have the ability to discern right and wrong. And there's some version of that still plays up to today. So if you're argued as unable to discern right and wrong at the time you commit a crime, you can qualify as insane. Right? Of course, how does it really work? You end up with experts on both sides. The prosecution has an expert saying, he wasn't insane, he could understand. The defense has an expert saying he was insane, he was incapable of understanding, and therefore irresponsible. They argue it out. And usually the decision is based, again, on who has the best high-priced lawyers and how high-profile of a case is it in the society. Is the judge going to be allowed to decide that person's insane or not? So again, it's social and political and financial considerations that really make the decision. But the rhetoric behind it is that it's whether that person is capable of discerning right and wrong. And this is very appealing to people because a lot of people have the idea that if I can get off of this on an insanity defense, I'm better off than being guilty and going to prison. Classic story from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? Jack Nicholson, McMurtry. That's how he got into the cuckoo's nest and ended up being lobotomized in the end, right? He thought, oh man, I'll just go over to the loony bin and say I'm crazy, go to the loony bin, I'll get a free ride away from going to jail. That happens to a lot of people. I'll tell you a story. There's an article on my website. It's called The Case of Sarab Hassan. It's about involuntary commitment in Texas. It's a good article. But when we were defending this guy, when they were trying to incarcerate him and then forcibly drug him. By the way, we lost the incarceration, but we won the forced drugging. So they released him because they didn't have anything else to do besides drug him. So even though they just argued that he was so dangerously mentally ill that he needed 90 days in there, as soon as they couldn't drug him, they sent him out the same night. Unbelievable. Anyway, in the hearing for the forced drugging, I made a comment that I think the person's better off going to prison than they are going to a psychiatric hospital. Not to mention the fact that it's more honest. And in this case, the guy he didn't want to be declared mentally ill. But the judge she was a woman, she was so offended, she says, are you saying it's better to go to a prison where you're going to get butt raped than go to a psychiatric facility where you can get help? And I said, well, you may get butt raped in prison, but you are for sure going to get raped in a psychiatric hospital because you're going to get forcibly drugged with toxic poisons. By definition, it's going to happen. You will get screwed. You will get injected against your will with poisons that cause permanent neurological damage and permanent metabolic damage. And that's a given. She didn't like to hear that. But a lot of people don't realize that, and they say it sounds pretty good. I'd rather go to the psych facility than prison, so I'm going to, let them declare me incompetent or insane. And a lot of times they'll actually avoid a trial in order to do that. It's called jail diversion. We know this person's mentally ill, so rather than hold them accountable in that system, we'll funnel them over here. One guy that I was involved with that maybe you've heard me talk about before, Rocky Erickson, the rock and roll pioneer who made a comeback the last few years after he'd been electroshocked and derailed by psychiatry. He had a when he was about 19 or 20, he had a charge for a marijuana cigarette and declared mentally ill to avoid the criminal charge. Got sent to Russ State Hospital, the criminally insane, where he languished for 3 years and probably would have been there a lot longer if a kind lawyer hadn't seen him there and took up his case and eventually got him out. It happens a lot, you know. So something that sounds pretty good, you know, but people don't understand how bad the psychiatric system is. But the bigger problem there is that the interface of psychiatry and law just completely erodes whatever there is in terms of a justice system within the law. Because the psychiatric approach basically says nobody's responsible, and that's the magic trick. The individual's not responsible. I can't help what I do. I'm mentally ill. The community and the family's not responsible. It's just that person's mentally ill. You know, and they're not responsible for their actions and their crimes. Nobody's responsible. You know, regardless of whether you have some distress or whatever, you know, it's like people are still responsible for their actions. It's the bottom line. And if it makes sense to extend mercy, then let's talk about extending mercy and not have to translate it as mentally ill. And if there's problems with our criminal justice system, let's deal with them. You know, I mean, remember, one of the bottom lines with psychiatric repression in terms of absolving responsibility is not only individual responsibility or family responsibility for that individual or community responsible for those individuals. It's also called that we are all absolved from responsibility to keep thinking and deal with social and economic justice issues. Because all these kids on Ritalin, it's just because of their ADHD. And all these millions and millions of depressions and amphetamine drugs, it's not because of failures in our economic system and our views about life. You know, it's just all these defective people, and et cetera, you know. It's like, so we don't have to think about how to set up the schools, how to set up the communities, how to set up the workplaces, how to deal with this onslaught of mindless consumerism and poisonous foods, you know? It's like, voila, it's gone. You don't have to think about it. So anyway, the bottom line, psychiatry and the law need to be separated if either one is going to be at all rational and thoughtful. And the insanity defense is a crock, you know? It doesn't mean that people don't have distress. It doesn't mean that people aren't necessarily thinking well when they do a specific action and don't need help. But the way out is not to say that they're defective and incapable of morality. It's not a way out. Zatz's bottom line is get rid of forced incarceration and voluntary commitment, get rid of the insanity defense, start sorting things out towards responsibility and self-determination. And I agree with him.
If you liked this video, we have hundreds of more alternative videos ranging from sexual health to psychology to mind control. So if you liked it, go ahead and click on me to enter the Psychetruth channel.